I'm Stephen Perry and I'm Chairman of London Export Corporation and Chairman of the 48 Group Club. I went to Beijing in 1972, 50 years ago now. I was part of the group that sold the first commodities from America to China. The bridge building project is giving us a great deal of opportunity to reflect upon. It is only by this type of thinking that we're going to find out what works. If we all knew what would work, we would all do it.
I'm David Valentine. In 1995, I was interviewed for my chief officer post with the new Angus Council. I strongly advised that even a small council could do some great things by engaging with local government in China. There's no doubt the economy in China has changed vastly in those 25 years that I've been involved. Seeing the improvements that have been taking place in China over the years, it's been an absolute joy to be part of that.
My name's Zoë Reed and I'm the chair of SACU, the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding. So we really do try to bring a window of the real world of China, the real people, into British eyes so that people can see for themselves how fascinating and lovely the Chinese people are. I think one of the things that the pandemic has taught us is that we can't pretend we're separate islands anymore.
Well, you saw them all there, but let me introduce them to you properly. We have with us on the stage Stephen Perry, who's chair of the 48 Group Club. Welcome. Zoë Reed, who's chair of the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding. Welcome to you also. And David Valentine at the end, former head of economic development at Angus Council in Scotland. Wonderful to be here with you in conversation. So we've called this panel Laying the Foundations. And I guess one of the things that you do have in common is that your relationships with China and your journey to build understanding between China and the UK all go back quite a long way. And Stephen, I want to begin with you. We heard about the original icebreakers. Your journey really began with your father, who was one of those icebreakers 70 years ago. And it was really an extraordinary mission, wasn't it?
It was indeed. I mean, goodness knows, it took him 7 days to fly from London to Hong Kong. It took 3 days to get all the visas sorted out in Hong Kong in what was then 95 degrees Fahrenheit heat and no air conditioning. And then 3 days to go to Beijing, fording 3 or 4 rivers on the way. And he saw terrible conditions. The people of China had suffered terribly. And everywhere there were emaciated people suffering from all kinds of problems. But he was overwhelmed by the determination, not only of the leaders of China, but the cadres of China and the people of China to rebuild their country. And he said, I've seen things today which I've never seen in my life. I hope I never have to see again. But I've also seen the people who will create the future. And when he came back, he told us with tears in his eyes, I never saw my father with tears in his eyes before, about what he had felt and experienced. And he said, but it will change. And it did. And now today, when we see the modern China leading the world in many different ways, it is a testimony to that foresight that they had then in 1952, 1953, to see the return of China. But it's also a testimony to all the people of China for making sure that China returned.
Well, as you say, foresight from those icebreakers, because it really did start something, didn't it, that mission?
London Export had been formed the year before. And then they formed the 48 Group Club. They formed the Icebreaker Mission, and then it was called the 48 Group Club. And that led to a major resumption in UK-China trade, and also throughout Western Europe as well. And then in 1972, we were involved in opening the trade with the United States and China. So it's been a very interesting journey that we've all been involved with. But I think for all of us from Britain that have been involved in the journey, whether it's in business or all the other different areas represented here today, it is an opportunity to touch the oldest civilization in the world. And when you touch it, you begin to realize that the concepts of harmony and so on that Xi Jinping talks about comes from deep in Chinese history and will be the basis of solving many of the world's problems. So I think it's been a very interesting education as well.
Zoe, I want to ask about your father too, because he was also a pioneer, wasn't he? One of the first ever adult Chinese students to come over and study in the UK. And you got to know him later in life, but how do you think that experience of coming here then shaped him?
Well, I think that's right. And following on the early bridge builder story, I mean, if Joseph Needham hadn't decided in the 40s and the 50s that he wanted to really open up an understanding about science and civilization in China to the West, then my father wouldn't have been one of the people that he sponsored to come over here and get his education. And the thing about my father was that he had, I only got to meet him when I was 46, so for the first time. But what I got to understand in those meetings with him was his passion for China, and that even the terrible childhood he'd had escaping the Japanese, as so many orphan boys were across China. He wanted to come to the West to upskill himself and then to go back and help build a new China. And that's what he did. And over the 25 years I've known my Chinese family, I've seen an extraordinary increase in their state of living and their openness to the world and building bridges the other way. So it's a real journey.
And talking of pioneers, we could call you one, David, because you really broke new ground when it came to twinning cities, one of the first people to really get on board with that idea, twinning cities between China and the UK, I should say. What was the inspiration behind that?
Well, I think the original idea, it came from a childhood curiosity. Basically, I looked at the textbooks at primary school and got a real interest trying to compare in my mind life in China for a Chinese family with my own. I was one of 7 kids. So I tried to visualize that, but I never got the chance until I became in charge of economic development with Angus Council. And I remember telling the council members at my interview in 1995 that the 21st century would belong to China and we must get on board, we must engage. Now it's interesting you ask about town twinning, because after the war, the Second World War, that's when the movement really got started, and it really meant engaging with places in Europe, to look at reconciliation and build trust and so on and so forth. But now I think there must be about 60 different twinning relationships between cities in the UK. Ours was developed with Yantai in Shandong. And through that, I know from all the businesses and people that's got engaged that it's been absolutely life-changing, because people have seen for themselves what is actually going on in China. And it's led to some fabulous results, not all of them associated with, business development or whatever, but there's been so many other benefits in terms of people-to-people relationships. And that's been really exciting.
So you have this long relationship with China, let's say. How do you think it's changed over that time? You've been there, of course. What have you seen? What's been the development, let's say?
Oh, it's been absolutely amazing. I mean, even within the first few years, we took our first trade mission there in 1998. And the amazing thing is, it's all my friends who I'm still friends with now in Scotland from the Chinese community that went with us to open up doors and so on. But at that time, I was there with my big, ugly-looking mobile phone, and all the kids were walking around with these small, Nokia-style mobile phones, speaking to each other just a few meters apart. And I couldn't believe it. This was 1998. I saw within 2 or 3 years fashions change. I saw the dirt track roads that were full of potholes in 1998 suddenly developed as part of the big infrastructure development into 3-lane, 4-lane highways. I've seen then, about 3 or 4 years into that, so before the year 2000, huge investments in regional airports and so on. So it's just been an absolute transformation. People's lives have changed immensely. We've a lot to learn from the economic miracle that the Chinese government have developed.
And Zoe, you were somebody who perhaps, again, only visited China later in your life, but you too have experienced enormous changes.
Oh yes, I mean obviously in terms of my family and their living circumstances, but also just rocking up in China in, you know, I mean when we first arrived in 1997, it took us 9 hours to fly to Beijing. My family had taken about 24 hours to come on a train from Lanzhou to Beijing, you know, so the immediate difference there. Just there were still then cars going up and down Wang Fujin Street. Now it's all pedestrianised, all looks very trendy. But the tone and feel of the people, always friendly and interesting, but just always forward-looking and seeing massive improvements and developments over the time.
So lots of physical changes, let's call them then. But how about in terms of engagement with China? How do you think that relationship has changed? Let me start with you, Stephen.
Engagement with China, which, I mean, goodness me, when I first went in '72, we went on. We did the first part of the journey on Pakistan Airlines. Air France also flew to Beijing, and that was it. It was a long journey, went all the way via Sri Lanka to be able to overfly into China. There were more horse and carts in Beijing's roads than there were cars, and the peasants were cultivating the fields right alongside the runway. You compare that to now, the most modern cities in the world are in China, and the 4 regions that are growing are going to be transformatory to the way in which the world urbanizes and handles the agrarian areas. But I think the engagement with China is proving to be what some of us anticipated it would be, that the return of China to being the great economic country that it was. 18 out of the 20 centuries before, China was the largest economy in the world, and it's well on its way, if not already, the largest economy in the world again. It's difficult for countries that have been used to leading and dominating the world to accept change. And that doesn't only apply to accepting China. There's lots of other countries that have been rising and developing. And those countries and the countries that have been there for a long time have to find the way to create a new connection. And it's not simple. It's not one party's fault or another party's. And we're going through that time of transition at the moment. And in some ways, it may last another 30 or 50 years. Transitions do take time. But I think that the recognition is beginning to dawn on what most of the people in this room know, which is that China's here. And whereas 20 years ago, there was only one Chinese company out of, if you take the top 20 sectors and the top 3 or 4 companies, there was only one. And that's 7, 8, 10 years ago. Today, it's probably at least in the 7 sectors there is a Chinese company. Within the next 10 years, there'll be a Chinese, 1 or 2 Chinese companies in each of those sectors. And it's not going to be possible to hold back the development of China. It's the development in China, just to finish, comes from what Joseph Needham found in Chongqing in the 1940s. The Chinese people work very hard. They're very innovative. They're not ideological in their analysis of technologies. They go and they build what they think is the right thing. At the end of it, the scientific method is probably the most significant feature, which means long-term planning happens in China, very difficult to do in the West.
And you have, of course, made lots of business connections in China, Stephen, as have you, David. I wonder if we could talk about those relationships, the business relationships, but also the personal relationships that you formed. How important are they, do you think?
I think the greatest gift from all the engagement I've been involved in is the people-to-people, the personal relationships. I mean, just last night, I was engaged on WeChat with a friend in Shenzhen. He works for a major retail outlet. When I met him several years ago, he was in charge of a supermarket. He's now a vice president. I've been very fortunate to name 2 of his children. And I've not been involved as long as Stephen has, But I've been very fortunate in the people I've met. I have two Chinese goddaughters, one from our sister city in Yantai, and she helped our sister city at a big conference in 1999, and I was very taken by her energy and commitment. She now is in a very senior executive position with a Chinese renewables company in Scotland, and has an office overlooking the Wallace Monument in Princess Street. I could go on. I've attended weddings. I mean, when you engage in China, okay, we were driving business outcomes and helping different businesses, but the real joy was and is the people involved.
And Zoe, as chair, of course, of the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, increasing that understanding between China and the UK is kind of what you do, if you like. How vital is it? And is there at the moment too much of a gap, a knowledge gap between the two?
I mean, obviously SACU was founded in 1965 by Joseph Needham and others. I mean, a big groundswell of people in the British establishment that wanted to build friendship and understanding between China and the UK in those days. And so we continue with that work. And I think what we're finding is a growing number of young British educated kids who've been to China and have worked there or studied there, and they don't like what they here when they come back here. They think it doesn't represent the real China. So they're wanting to share their knowledge and their understanding, and they come, these people with knowledge of how to use TikTok and WeChat and all the social media stuff to really try and get that story out and so we want to build on the people-to-people exchanges, but the sharing of knowledge between the two cultures is a critical part of the way forward.
And of course, this is in conversation with the bridge builders. You're all people who've been working towards that. I wonder if you could give us an insight into how you think it can best be carried on. Let me ask you, David.
Well, politics comes into it, doesn't it? And I'm thinking that, back in 1952, what the world was 2.5 billion people. Things have changed since then. I mean, a third of the world's population now is in China and India. We're pushing past 8 billion people globally. So we've got to realize that there needs to be a different order, and we need to look at the great improvements that China, I mean, I've already described it as an economic miracle. We should look at the common interests. Actually, going back to the week that supposedly changed the world in 1972 and Nixon and all that, we were then talking about looking at the common interests and focusing on the things we can do together, being honest with each other. I think there should be more honesty, but I think there should be less hostility, there should be less aggression, there should be more understanding. So we need to get that message through because there is so much at stake. And I don't just mean the success of businesses, although that is hugely important for both sides of the equation, but it's about peace and prosperity and harmony. And that's what we should be focused on. China is a huge power and will be in the future. We need to engage and we need to talk.
I want to hone in on the business aspect just for a moment with you, Stephen. How do you think China's relationship with the UK in terms of business, economy and trade can be continued and develop?
I think, during a period of transition, which is a long period, when the Vice President of China was here recently, he said the general trend has been a good one for over 50 years. He said, but there's always ups and downs. And we're in a bit of a down. But for those of us who've been going backwards and forwards to China in the ways in which we have, it's a reality that if the British want to be a global Britain, and I think that's a great ambition to have, we have a lot of assets for that ambition, that the continent that's developing the most in the world is Asia, and at the center of Asia is China. And we have to have a working relationship with China. And I'm sure we will have, because things have a habit of working out in conformity with the realities. So I think so long as we're patient, we don't get too frustrated along the way, for those of us who have a great positive feeling about getting the relationship right, we just have to play our part quietly and gently in helping to open up those doors in the many areas. I think climate and health are two obvious ones, with COVID and together with climate warming, where Britain and China can have a great cooperation. Energy is a third one, and education is certainly a fourth. These are areas where we're pushing open doors on both sides. And for the moment, we have to concentrate on pushing at the doors on both sides. Eventually, they'll widen to other areas as we feel more confidence again. Not all the problems come in the bilateral relationship, some come from outside of it, and we have to accept that different peoples and different countries have different ways of operating, and try to help them understand what we've all seen.
So lots of specific areas to think about, but Zoe, if I can give the last word to you. At the end of the day, it's about improving communication and improving understanding between the two, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think Britain should be in a good place, given the diversity of the population, to think from different perspectives, to understand that the world isn't just the way we see it, that there are other perspectives and worlds, and we should embrace China in that conversation, and that's certainly what we're keen to focus on. So yeah, so continue the bridge building with my colleagues here, you know.
Well, thank you very much. It was wonderful to have this conversation. We really appreciate you joining us today. That's Stephen Perry, Chairman of the 48 Group Club, Zoë Reed, Chair of the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, and David Valentine, who's the former Head of Economic Development at Angus Council in Scotland. Thank you very much.
Thank you.